it must continue to be heard. From the March on Washington to the Voting Rights Act, your souls bear witness to the struggle which continues. Let us now step forward and bear witness. Beginning with Julia Ellen Davis.
I bear witness on behalf of Ellen Craft, my great-great-grandmother. She and her husband escaped from slavery in 4 days from Macon, Georgia to Maryland in December 1848. And after living in England for about 18 years, they moved back to this country with their 5 children because she did not want them to be born into slavery. So they waited. They came to this area, and they ended up dying here in Charleston with their daughter, Ellen Craft Crum, who married Dr. Crum. But the rumors had started by the Southerners who came to visit in England and saw her, as she and her husband were abolitionists in Boston and Massachusetts as well as in England. And she made the statement when she heard they had said that she wanted to go back to live in Georgia as a slave. So she said, "I'd much rather starve in England, a free woman, than to be a slave for the best man that ever breathed upon the American continent."
Mrs. Cecilia Gordon Rogers, would you come and bear witness?
Good afternoon. As a 17-year-old Burke High School senior, I bear witness to the very first sit-ins at the Woolworth and Crest counters. Has truly made a difference in my life, a great impact. Think about having a senior banquet for students, and most of your participants are participating in the very first sit-in at the counters in Charleston, South Carolina. Someone mentioned the churches. All of those secret meetings were held at churches, in the home of Millicent and Minerva Brown with her parents. It's amazing to think of what could have happened. There were so many of us that they put us in the courtroom and not in cells. But when I think of the day, it really impacts what I give to others today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Rogers. I also bear witness to that day, April 1st, 1960. Mrs. Robinson, Priscilla Robinson, would you bear witness for us?
I'm Priscilla Robinson. I bear witness as a participant in the Civil Rights Movement in Petersburg, Virginia. My life sort of paralleled Millicent's life and Minerva's life in that my family was very politically active in Petersburg. I bear witness as a person who grew up in a household that was always reading black literature, from the early Jet magazines to the Negro Digest, Afro-American newspaper. So we were always familiar with things that were going on nationwide. I bear witness as a participant, as a sit-inner, a picketer, and as a young person who had the opportunity to meet Dr. Martin Luther King as well as some of the other notables in the civil rights movement, particularly the person who started the civil rights movement in Petersburg, Virginia was, and I'm kind of rushing trying to get through this, Wyatt T. Walker. Some of you know who he was. He was the first aide to Martin Luther King. I bear witness to the March on Washington as well as the march from Selma to Montgomery.
If you have a dream, don't just stop there. If you have a dream, don't just stand there. Get in this march. I remember this mantra, adopting this mantra in 1969 when I was standing at the corner passively holding a Martin Luther King poster stapled to a yardstick, because I was determined to see how many people were in that march against MUSC and the strike that was at the medical university. First, News and Courier said, oh, there wouldn't be more than 1,000 people in the march. And then they said the next day there were 3,500. And some of our columnists said there were over 10,000 people in the march. And there was Coretta Scott King, just a year after her husband was killed. There was Walter Reuther. There was Reverend Abernathy. And as the Operation Catch-Up kids, and I left that area. And so John Conroy and Reverend Abernathy, nose to nose there near the church. We walked away because we had to go home. It was getting late in the afternoon. And a group of guardsmen approached us with bayonets drawn, pointed those bayonets at us and tried to stop us from going through the King Street area. And we sort of ran through Edwards department store, 5 and Dime, and we escaped out the King Street exit, the front King Street exit. And we got out of there. And people don't believe that there were tanks in the streets. And there were bayonets pointed at people, young people, teenagers. So, if you have a dream, don't just stand there. Get in this march.
Last but not least, Mrs. Leela Potts Campbell will bear witness.
My story starts in 1944, and that is when my family, I wasn't quite here yet, but I moved to Charleston, South Carolina, and my father became the principal of Avery. I won't go into all of his principalship, but during that time, he gathered a lot of people in the community. When there were children, and there were quite a few, who could not go to college, but wanted to go to college, he had the money to get these kids to college for 4 years. They learned study habits and all of that, you see, before they left. And I want to just tell you briefly one story that one of those students told to me. During that time, we also had 9 different girls living with us from James Island. And the objective, you see, was during that time there was no transportation to Charleston if you lived on James Island. So they came to live with us. If they wanted to go to college, then he took them. If they didn't, he went back, took them back, and then got someone else. Although, of course, there was a line there. There were people there in James Island cultivating the students that would come to Avery. So it wasn't like, oh, I'll pick you and you and you. It wasn't like that at all. It was all prepared. And about 10 years ago, one of these students came up to me, and my sisters happened to be there, and said, I have just got to tell you this story. You just have to hear what happened with me and your father. She said, one day he came up to me and said, Francina, are you still want to go to South Carolina State? And she says, oh yes, oh yes. They were not allowed to say yes sir and yes ma'am. It was yes pleasantly and no pleasantly. And so he said to her, well, then come on, let's just go, it's just time. And so the 2 of them got in the car, and they were about 2 blocks away, and she said she burst into tears. And so he looked at her and said, well, Francina, what is the matter with you? And she says, Dr. Potts, I don't have any clothes or any sheets or anything to take with me. He said, oh, is that all? So he says, you know, she's still crying, and he goes right back to the house on Montague Street, where nobody talked to us, because we were the only black family on that street. I mean, 10 years living there, and nobody talked to us. Anyway, we went in, and my mother was at the door and said, well, I thought you were taking Francina to South Carolina State. He said, well, I was, but she started crying and said she didn't have any clothes or all that stuff that you women need. So he said, well, I need to take her tomorrow. So she needs to be ready tomorrow. So the next day, she had 2 suitcases of clothes. She had towels, sheets, pillows, and all those other things women need. And she went to college. She never knew who paid for her college education, but she knew of the other 9 young ladies from James Island that had the same experience. And she said, none of us would ever be where we are without it. And I tell you this story because I've been very, very choked up about what we've been talking about here today, which is, well, we can't do anything, so we just might as well give up, basically. Everything is too hard. It is not too hard. Maybe we won't get 1 million people, but if we become a committee of 1 or 3 or 5 and can keep our mouths shut, we can do this. You know, this was done when it was harder than it is now. There are more of us with money, and so it can be done.
All right. Thank you so much, Rita, for those words of encouragement. I believe we have one more witness, but ever so briefly before I call that president of Voorhees College. One day we decided in Charleston that we were going to hop on a city bus, a segregated city bus. This was before, or perhaps just right after Rosa Parks did her thing. And Leela and I sat down on the first seat behind the driver. You know, God takes care of fools and babies, okay? Because we really could have gotten killed that day. But Leela, I know you and I will never ever forget the look in the eyes of that driver as he turned around to us and uttered these words, "Live dangerously, die young." What an impact that had on us. And I wish he were around today so I could tell him that I live dangerously, but obviously I didn't.
Person in the house and the youngest person in the house to come forward so that we can close out with a ritual of passing the torch. And as they're coming forward, I want to just say, one of the things that's important in our community, that's a part of our tradition, is ritual. And I think it's important to observe rituals, particularly as we pass the torch to the younger generation. Because ritual affirms who we are as a people, it gives us strength, it recognizes our spirituality. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to ask our elder if she would metaphorically pass the torch of this lantern to our youngest member of the community today. And in keeping with words that come from Mary Church Terrell, passing the torch in our community has meant lifting as we climb. And so lifting as we climb, onward and upward we go, struggling and striving, and hoping that the buds and blossoms of our desires will burst into glorious fruition ere long. With courage, born of success, achieved in the past, with a keen sense of the responsibility which we shall continue to assume, we look forward to a future large with promise and hope, seeking no favors because of our color, nor patronage because of our needs. We knock at the bar of justice, asking an equal chance, lifting as we climb. Would you pass the torch to our young member of the community who has a very brief thing that she'd like to say?
I, Regine Garrett, age 12, promise to carry on the spirit of my ancestors.
Ashe. Your turn now.